Helen stood knee-deep in scalding steam behind the festival stage, her skin blistering as she clutched a stack of scorched, dripping ledger pages. Across from her, Diane looked not like a traitor, but like a ghost, her hands trembling as she reached for the evidence Helen had just risked her life to pull from the lobster boilers. "You think I was stealing?" Diane whispered over the roar of the crowd, her voice cracking under the weight of a 5-year lie. "Helen, look at the dates. Look at where the money actually went." In that moment, the victory Helen had fought for felt like a mouthful of broken glass. She had spent months tracking missing funds and fending off thugs, certain she was the hero of a corporate takeover. But as the ink bled across the ruined paper, a single name appeared over and over in the private accounts. A name that changed everything. Helen wasn't the victim of a greedy partner. She was the reason they were both standing in the ruins of their lives. The only question left was how many people Helen had destroyed while trying to save a dream that had been dead for years. The bilge water lapped at Helen's knees, cold fingers of salt and diesel seeping through her overalls. She jammed the wrench against the valve stem, muscles burning as she torqued it clockwise. The metal groaned, then gave just enough. Water hissed through the gap, spraying her face. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist, tasting copper and rust. Outside, the storm hammered the workshop roof like a drunken brawler. Rain sluiced down the grimy windows, turning the world into a blur of gray and black. The boat, a local trawler named the Mary Beth, creaked and shifted in its cradle as another gust hit the structure. Helen's fingers numbed around the wrench, the freezing brine making her skin feel tight and brittle. She braced her boot against the hull, heaving again with a grunt that was half prayer, half curse. The valve squealed, resisting with the stubbornness of 50 years of corrosion, before finally clicking shut. The sudden silence of the rushing water was replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thrumming of rain on the corrugated metal above. Helen stayed crouched in the dark, cramped space of the bilge for a moment, her breath coming in ragged white plumes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. This shop, this boat, the very air she breathed felt like it was under siege. She climbed out of the hull, her boots squelching on the oil-stained concrete. The workshop was a cavern of shadows, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of a dying fluorescent bulb. Near the front office, Diane Foster stood like a ghost, her pale skin stark against the dark wood of the counter. She wasn't looking at the boat. She was staring at a stack of invoices, her fingers tracing the red ink like she was reading Braille for the damned. The paper was translucent from the humidity, the edges curling. Helen grabbed a rag and began wiping the grease from her knuckles, the movement jerky and aggressive. She didn't want to hear what Diane had to say. She knew the rhythm of this dance by heart. Client's engines still coughing. Helen said, her voice a rough grate of sound. "Bolts are seized. Gonna need the torch." Diane didn't look up. Her shoulders were tight, pulled toward her ears as if she were bracing for a blow. "We're 3 weeks behind on the electric bill, Helen." The landlord called again. He wasn't polite this time. Helen exhaled through her nose, the scent of menthol and motor oil clinging to her. She looked at the invoices Diane held, a mountain of debt that seemed to grow every time she turned her back. The numbers were staggering, a weight that threatened to pull the entire shop into the dark water of the harbor. "Tell him we'll have it by Friday," Helen muttered, though the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. "You said that last Friday, and the Friday before." Diane finally looked at her, her brown eyes wide and shimmering with a desperation that Helen couldn't stand to witness. "Helen, the ledger, it's a bloodbath. We're not just struggling, we're drowning." The argument was a familiar one, a script they had performed a dozen times in the last month. Diane wanted to talk about reality, about the cold, hard facts of bankruptcy and foreclosure. Helen wanted to talk about engines. Engines could be fixed. You could take them apart, clean the points, replace the gaskets, and they would roar back to life. But money? Money was a ghost that haunted the corners of the shop, invisible and untouchable. "We have the schooner restoration coming in," Helen countered, slamming her wrench onto the workbench. The clang echoed through the rafters, sharp and final. "That's a big contract. It'll clear the arrears." "If we can afford the parts to start it," Diane snapped, her voice rising for the first time. "We're at the end of the line, Helen. There's no more credit. There's no more time." The tension between them was a physical thing. A wire pulled so tight it hummed. Helen opened her mouth to snap back, to tell Diane to stay in the office and leave the heavy lifting to her. But the roll-up door rattled violently. It wasn't the wind this time. Someone was kicking the metal, a heavy, rhythmic thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The door flew upward with a screech of unlubricated rollers. A man stepped in, silhouetted against the gray sheets of rain. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a leather jacket that glistened with moisture, and he moved with a heavy, predatory grace. This wasn't a client. This was the physical manifestation of the debt Diane had been crying about. "McCarthy?" The man growled, his voice a low rumble that cut through the sound of the storm. Helen stepped forward, her hand instinctively closing around the handle of a heavy pipe wrench. "Who's asking?" "The bank's tired of waiting," the man said. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked into the shop, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the concrete. He looked around with a sneer, his gaze lingering on the vintage outboard motor sitting on a stand near the door. A 1954 Johnson that Helen had spent months meticulously restoring for an old fisherman in town. "Nice place you got here. Shame it's all forfeit." Diane stepped back, her face losing what little color it had left. "We're working on the payment. We just need a little more time." The man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Time's up, sweetheart. I'm here to collect. Or at least, I'm here to make sure you understand the cost of being late." Before Helen could react, the man swung a heavy boot. He kicked the stand holding the vintage Johnson. The motor crashed to the floor with a sickening crunch of metal and shattered porcelain. Pieces of the cowling skittered across the floor, reflecting the dim light like broken teeth. Something snapped inside Helen. It wasn't just about the motor. It was the violation of the space, the insult to the work, the sheer arrogance of the threat. She didn't think. She didn't calculate. She simply moved. She lunged forward, the pipe wrench swinging in a wide, lethal arc. The man saw it coming and dodged, but Helen was faster than she looked. She used the momentum to drive her shoulder into his chest, pinning him against the side of a half-repaired dory. He gasped, his eyes widening as he realized he wasn't dealing with a frightened shopkeeper. He tried to throw a punch, a clumsy hook aimed at her jaw, but Helen ducked. She brought the wrench up, catching him in the ribs with a dull thud. "Out!" Helen hissed, her voice dropping to a lethal growl. "Get out of my shop before I put you in a crate." The man snarled, reaching into his jacket. But Helen didn't give him the chance. She swung again, the heavy iron tool whistling through the air. It caught him on the forearm, a strike that surely cracked the bone. He cried out, stumbling back toward the open door. The rain lashed at his back, turning his leather jacket into a dark, slick skin. He scrambled back, his bravado evaporating in the face of Helen's cold, focused rage. He tripped over the threshold, falling onto the wet gravel of the lot. As he scrambled to his feet, a black leather folder slipped from his jacket, unnoticed by him as he beat a hasty retreat into the darkness, his engine roaring as he sped away from the docks. Helen stood in the doorway, her chest heaving, the rain cooling the fire in her blood. She watched the taillights vanish into the gray blur of the storm. Her knuckles ached where she had gripped the wrench too tight. Behind her, Diane was silent, a hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the wreckage of the Johnson motor. Helen turned back, her gaze falling on the black folder lying in the mud just outside the door. She stepped out, ignoring the rain that instantly soaked through her bandana, and snatched it up. It was heavy, the leather cold and embossed with a generic corporate logo. Back inside, she kicked the door shut and walked to the office desk, the folder dripping onto the floor. She flipped it open. The first page was a formal legal notice. The words, "Notice of Foreclosure and Seizure," printed in bold, uncompromising black. It was dated 3 days ago. "You knew," Helen said, her voice trembling with a new kind of heat. She looked at Diane. "You knew they were coming for the building." Diane didn't look at her. She was staring at the wall, her expression unreadable. "I tried to tell you, Helen. I tried to make you listen. This isn't just a late bill, Diane. This is an eviction." Helen threw the folder onto the desk. "Why didn't you show me this?" "Because I thought I could fix it," Diane finally yelled, her voice cracking. "I thought I could find a way out without you burning the whole place down in a fit of pride." Helen didn't answer. She felt a sudden, hollow space opening up in her chest. She turned away from Diane, her gaze drifting to the desk. Not the invoices, but the drawer Diane always kept locked. The key was sitting in the lock, likely forgotten in the chaos of the thug's arrival. Helen reached out and pulled the drawer open. Inside was a roll of heavy vellum paper, tied with a professional blue ribbon. She pulled it out and spread it across the desk, pushing the invoices aside. They weren't boat repairs. They were architectural renderings. The title block in the corner read, "Oakhaven North Star Resort, Phase 1 Niman." The drawings showed a sprawling complex of glass and steel, luxury condos, and a deep-water marina with slips for yachts that cost more than the entire town of Oakhaven. And there, right in the center of the development, where the McCarthy and Foster shop currently stood, was a planned waterfront bistro and boutique. Helen's eyes drifted to the bottom of the cover sheet. There, on the line for "Authorized Representative," was a signature. Diane Foster. The ink was dry, the loops of the D and the F elegant and final. Helen felt the world tilt. The storm outside was nothing compared to the cold, silent wrecking ball that had just swung through the center of her life. "Helen, wait!" Diane started, her voice soft, pleading. But Helen wasn't listening. She was looking at the signature, realizing that the woman standing 3 feet away wasn't her partner. She was the architect of the end. The silence in the shop was thick, heavy with the smell of wet wool and betrayal. Helen stared at the blueprints, the blue lines of the resort looking like a roadmap to a future she wasn't invited to. She felt Diane's gaze on her, a weight on the back of her neck, but she couldn't bring herself to turn around. If she looked at Diane now, she might actually do something they'd both regret. "It's not what it looks like," Diane whispered. The phrase was a cliché, a cheap shield, and they both knew it. "It looks like my shop is a bistro," Helen said, her voice dangerously calm. "It looks like you sold the dirt under my feet while I was busy keeping the boats afloat." Before Diane could respond, the sound of a heavy vehicle pulling into the lot cut through the rain. Headlights swept across the grimy windows, casting long, distorted shadows of the tools on the walls. A siren gave a short, authoritative chirp. Helen straightened her back, her hand moving back to the pipe wrench on the counter. The roll-up door hadn't been locked after the thug left. It groaned as someone hauled it up from the outside. Two men stepped into the shop. One was Sheriff Elias Carter, his tan uniform dark with rain, his face set in a grim expression that spoke of long years of doing things he didn't like. Beside him was a man in an expensive charcoal overcoat, holding a leather briefcase like a weapon. He was younger, polished, his hair perfectly styled despite the weather. Gregory Holloway, the representative from North Star Marina. "Helen, Diane," the sheriff said, nodding to each of them. He didn't take off his hat. Water dripped from the brim onto the concrete. "Elias," Helen acknowledged, her eyes darting to the man in the overcoat. "You're a long way from the station." "I'm here in an official capacity, Helen," the sheriff said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded document. He looked at it for a second, then handed it toward her. "I've been asked to serve this." Helen didn't take it. She didn't have to. She could see the header. Cease and desist order. "This is a formal notification." Holloway stepped forward, his voice smooth and devoid of any local accent. It was the voice of boardrooms and glass towers. "As of 1800 hours today, all commercial activity at this location is to terminate immediately. This includes all ongoing repairs, restorations, and maintenance." Helen felt a cold spike of adrenaline. "I have a schooner in the back, Holloway. The Windward. It's a 100-year-old hull. If I stop working on it now, the seals will fail. She'll warp." "That is no longer our concern, Miss McCarthy," Holloway said, clicking open his briefcase. He pulled out a set of keys that looked remarkably like the ones Helen had in her pocket. "The property has been acquired. Any further work constitutes trespassing and destruction of corporate assets." He looked around the shop, his lip curling slightly as his gaze passed over the oil stains, the rusted tools, and the shattered Johnson motor. "Frankly, looking at the state of this facility, we're doing you a favor. This is a liability waiting to happen. A favor." Helen stepped toward him, the wrench still in her hand. The sheriff shifted his weight, his hand resting casually near his belt. Not on his gun, but close enough. "This shop has been here since before your daddy was in diapers. We build things here. We fix things. We don't just push paper and call it progress. What you do here is obsolete," Holloway said, his tone dismissive. "Oakhaven is changing. You can either be part of that change or be buried by it. Now, step away from the vessels." Helen looked at Diane, expecting her to say something, to defend the work they had done together. But Diane was looking at the floor, her arms crossed tight over her chest. She looked small. She looked defeated. "Sheriff," Helen said, her voice cracking. "You're really going to do this? You've known my family your whole life." Elias Carter sighed, a sound of ancient weariness. "The law's the law, Helen. The deed's been recorded. I don't have a choice in the matter." "Get out," Helen said, turning her back on them. "Ms. McCarthy, I must insist—" Holloway started. "I said get out," Helen roared, spinning back around. The rage in her eyes was enough to make even Holloway take a step back. "You served your papers. Now get off my property before I decide to see how that fancy coat handles a dip in the harbor." The sheriff put a hand on Holloway's arm. "Come on, Greg. We're done here for tonight. They have until morning to vacate." They left, the sound of their boots echoing on the gravel. Diane followed them out a few minutes later, not saying a word. Her car engine a lonely hum that faded into the distance. Helen was alone. The shop felt cavernous, the shadows stretching out to swallow the tools and the boats. She walked to the back, to the Windward. The schooner sat in its cradle, the wood dark and smelling of cedar and linseed oil. It was a beautiful thing, a testament to a craft that was being erased by luxury bistros and boutique hotels. She waited. She sat on a milk crate in the dark, smoking a menthol cigarette until the clock on the wall ticked past midnight. The storm had settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse. She stood up and reached for her welding torch. She wasn't going to let the windward rot. If this was her last night in the shop, she was going to spend it doing the only thing she knew how to do. She cracked the valves on the tanks, the hiss of gas a comforting sound in the silence. She struck the igniter. A gout of orange flame roared out of the tip, far larger and more violent than it should have been. It leapt toward her face, the heat searing her eyebrows. Helen stumbled back, dropping the torch. It clattered on the floor, the flame licking at a puddle of spilled solvent. She scrambled to shut the valves, her heart racing. When the fire was out, she inspected the lines. The rubber had been sliced, neat, surgical cuts that were hidden beneath the protective braiding. It wasn't an accident. It was sabotage. Before she could process the thought, the hum of the shop's refrigerator died. The small clock on the wall stopped ticking. The single security light over the door flickered once and went dark. The entire building was plunged into a blackness so thick it felt like physical weight. Someone had cut the main power line. Helen stayed perfectly still, her ears straining. Above the sound of the rain, she heard it. A floorboard groaned in the loft. A heavy, deliberate footstep. She wasn't alone. She didn't reach for a flashlight. She knew this shop better than she knew her own skin. Her hand found the heavy iron wrench she'd left on the workbench. She moved silently, her boots barely making a sound on the concrete, heading toward the stairs that led to the storage loft. Another creak, then the sound of a metal latch being turned. Helen lunged. She didn't wait to see who it was. She swung the wrench at the shadow moving near the rear exit. The figure grunted, dodging the blow, and shoved a heavy crate of parts toward her. Helen stumbled, the metal clattering as she regained her balance. The intruder bolted out the back door, heading toward the docks. Helen was right behind them. The rain was freezing, a million needles of ice hitting her skin. The docks were slick with a mixture of seawater and spilled oil, a treacherous maze of ropes and cleats. The figure ahead of her was fast, a dark shape weaving between the moored boats. Helen cut through a narrow gap between two storage sheds, intercepting the intruder near the end of the main pier. She tackled them, the two of them slamming into the wet wood with a jar that rattled Helen's teeth. They scrambled in the dark, a frantic mess of limbs and wet fabric. The intruder was strong, their movements practiced. They gripped Helen's throat, their fingers digging into her windpipe. Helen gasped, her vision blurring. She reached into her jacket pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the emergency flare gun she always kept for offshore repairs. She pulled it out and jammed it against the intruder's side, pulling the trigger. The thump of the launch was followed by a blinding burst of crimson light. The flare shrieked into the sky, illuminating the docks in a hellish, flickering red. The intruder recoiled, shielded their eyes, and Helen used the moment to roll on top of them. She grabbed the edge of the figure's mask, a simple black balaclava, and ripped it off. It wasn't a thug. It wasn't the man from the bank. It was a woman. Sharp features, green eyes wide with shock, a face Helen didn't recognize but realized she had seen in the background of the Marina Cafe for weeks. "Who the hell are you?" Helen demanded, her voice a rasping growl. The woman didn't answer. She was staring at the flare as it drifted down toward the water. In her hand, she clutched a small, leather-bound logbook. Helen snatched it away. She flipped it open under the dying red light of the flare. It was a diary of failure. Dates, times, photos of the shop's disrepair, notes on Helen's erratic behavior, logs of every missed shipment and unpaid bill. "I'm a private investigator," the woman finally said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I was hired to document the mismanagement of the facility." "Hired by who?" Helen asked, though she already knew the answer. The cold in her bones had nothing to do with the rain anymore. "Diane Foster," the woman whispered. "She needed proof of a breach of contract to trigger the hostile takeover clause. She wanted you out, Helen. Legally." Helen let go of the woman's collar. She stood up, the logbook heavy in her hand. The flare went out, plunging the docks back into the gray, miserable light of the storm. The investigator scrambled to her feet and vanished into the shadows, but Helen didn't follow. She walked back toward the shop, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't go to the boats. She went to the office. She didn't have the key to the safe, but she didn't need it. She grabbed a heavy pry bar from the wall and wedged it into the seam of the metal door. She heaved, her muscles screaming, her mind a white-hot blur of betrayal. The metal groaned and shrieked, the lock finally snapping with a sound like a gunshot. She pulled out the thick, leather-bound ledgers, the real ones, not the sanitized versions Diane showed the taxman. She sat at the desk, the rain still dripping from her bandana onto the pages, and began to read. She was going to find the truth, even if it burned the whole town down. The hours between midnight and dawn were a blur of numbers and acrid coffee. Helen sat hunched over the ledgers, her eyes burning under the harsh glow of a battery-powered work light. She wasn't an accountant, but she knew the language of the shop. The cost of parts, the hours of labor, the rhythm of the seasons. What she found in the books wasn't just debt. It was a systematic dismantling of their shared life. There were withdrawals, thousands of dollars, taken in small, jagged increments that didn't align with any invoice or payroll. They were labeled as miscellaneous expenses or petty cash. But the frequency was a drumbeat of theft. Diane had been skimming. For months, while Helen was wrestling with rusted engines and begging for more time, Diane had been bleeding the accounts dry. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, a stone in her gut that made every breath a struggle. She had trusted Diane with the one thing she couldn't understand, the money. And Diane had used that trust to sharpen the knife she was now burying in Helen's back. By 6 a.m., the rain had stopped, replaced by a thick, oppressive fog that clung to the harbor like a shroud. A sharp rap at the door made Helen jump, her hand instinctively flying to the pry bar. It was a courier, a young kid in a rain-slicked uniform who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He handed her a legal envelope, his eyes darting to the broken safe behind her. "Notice for Ms. McCarthy," he muttered, before turning and jogging back to his van. Helen tore it open. It was from North Star. Notice of accelerated closing. Because of the structural instability and safety risks documented in the investigator's report, the closing date had been moved up. Not next week, not tomorrow. Today, at 10 a.m., during the opening ceremony of the Oak Haven Lobster Festival. Helen looked at the clock. She had less than 4 hours. The Oak Haven town green was a riot of noise and color that felt like an insult to the gray reality of Helen's morning. The smell of boiling salt water and melted butter hung heavy in the air, mixed with the excited chatter of tourists and the rhythmic thumping of a local folk band. It was the one day of the year the town felt alive. And today, it was the day the heart was being cut out of it. Helen pushed through the crowd, her grease-stained overalls and wild, silver-streaked hair making her look like a specter at the feast. People moved out of her way, sensing the kinetic energy radiating from her, the cold, focused rage of a woman with nothing left to lose. She saw the main stage, draped in its patriotic bunting, the 50 years strong banner flapping in the breeze. And there, standing in the shadows behind the podium, was Diane. She was wearing a tailored navy suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, looking every bit the successful corporate partner. She was talking to a group of men in suits, the North Star executives, her smile practiced and hollow. Helen didn't wait for an introduction. She vaulted over the low railing at the back of the stage, the scorched ledger clutched in her hand like a holy relic. "Diane!" she roared. The music didn't stop, but the conversation did. Diane turned, her face going pale as she saw Helen. The executives stepped back, their expressions shifting from polite interest to wary confusion. "Helen, what are you doing here?" Diane hissed, stepping forward to intercept her. "This is a public event. You're making a scene." "I'm making a scene." Helen laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. She held up the ledger, the edges of the pages blackened from the fire she'd almost started with the torch. "I've been reading your bedtime stories, Diane. The ones where you take our money and bury it in miscellaneous expenses. I've got the proof right here. Skimming, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. You want to talk about a scene? Let's call the sheriff over and see how he likes these numbers." Diane's eyes darted to the executives, then back to Helen. Her composure was cracking, the mask of the professional woman slipping to reveal the terrified girl beneath. "Helen, stop. You don't understand. You're going to ruin everything. Everything's already ruined." Helen stepped closer, her voice rising over the sound of the band. "You sold the shop. You hired a spy to follow me, and you've been stealing from me for years. Sign the papers voiding the sale, Diane. Now. Or I walk this book right over to the station." They were in the temporary kitchen area now, a maze of stainless steel tables and massive high-pressure boilers used for the community lobster bake. The air was thick with scalding steam, the hiss of the valves a constant, aggressive background noise. "I won't do it," Diane said, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "The deal is done, Helen. It has to be done." She lunged. It wasn't a calculated move. It was a desperate, animalistic grab for the ledger. Helen pulled back, but the floor was slick with condensation. They stumbled together, a tangle of limbs and resentment, crashing against a heavy metal table. Diane's fingers clawed at the book. She managed to snag the edge of the cover, pulling with a strength born of pure panic. "Give it to me." "Never." Helen shoved her back, but Diane didn't let go. In the struggle, the ledger flew from their hands. It arced through the air, a dark bird against the white steam, and landed squarely on the rim of the largest boiler. It teetered there for a second, the heat already curling the pages. "No." Helen dived forward. She didn't think about the temperature. She didn't think about the pressure. She reached into the cloud of scalding vapor, her skin instantly screaming as the heat hit her arms. Her fingers closed around the leather spine just as it began to slide into the boiling water. She pulled it back, falling onto the wet grass behind the stage, gasping for air. Her forearms were a bright, angry red, the pain a pulsing rhythm that matched her heartbeat. But she had the book. She looked up, ready to deliver the final blow, to denounce Diane in front of the whole town. But Diane wasn't fighting anymore. She was sitting on the ground, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. "It was 5 years, Helen," Diane whispered, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the steam. Helen frowned, the adrenaline starting to ebb, leaving her cold and hollow. "What are you talking about?" "The shop. It's been insolvent for 5 years." Diane looked up, her face a mask of grief and exhaustion. "We haven't made a profit since your father died. Not a real one. Every time you thought we had a good month, every time you thought we were finally getting ahead, it was me. I was funneling my inheritance into the accounts, my mother's savings, everything I had." Helen felt the world shift again, the ground beneath her feet turning to silt. No, that's not possible. The contracts, the work. The work didn't cover the taxes, Helen. It didn't cover the insurance or the utilities or the debt your father left behind. Diane screamed, the sound cutting through the festive music like a knife. "You wouldn't listen. You just kept working, kept pretending that if you just turned one more bolt, everything would be fine. But it wasn't fine. We were drowning, and I was the only one holding your head above water." Helen looked down at the ledger. She opened it to the pages she'd flagged, the skimming. She looked at the dates. She looked at the amounts. $200. The exact amount of the property tax bill from 6 months ago. $850. The utility arrears from last winter. $3,000. The insurance premium that Helen had thought was waived because of a clerical error. The money hadn't gone to a secret account. It had gone into the shop. Diane hadn't been stealing. She had been desperately trying to keep the lights on without letting Helen realize she was a failure. "My mother," Diane said, her voice breaking. "She's sick, Helen. She needs specialized care. I ran out of money. I didn't have anything left to give. North Star. They offered enough to pay off the debts, get her into the facility. That's why I did it. To save her. And to save you from being buried under a mountain of debt you could never pay back." Helen stood there in the rain, the scorched ledger heavy in her hand. The evidence of Diane's betrayal was actually a record of her own blindness. Her pride, her stubborn refusal to look at the truth, had turned her best friend into a ghost. The North Star executives walked around the corner, their faces set in impatient lines. They were followed by a notary and a man holding a silver pen. "Ms. McCarthy, Ms. Foster," the lead executive said, his voice cold and professional. "The time is 10:15. We have the documents ready for the final transfer. Shall we proceed?" Helen looked at Diane, who was still sitting on the grass, a broken woman in a ruined suit. She looked at the executives, the vultures waiting to feast on the carcass of her father's dream. She had no legal ground left, no moral ground, just a scorched book and a heart that felt like it had been through a thresher. The North Star CEO, Richard Vane, didn't just walk. He glided onto the festival grounds like a king surveying a conquered province. His silver hair was perfectly slicked back, and his tailored suit looked like it was made of some high-tech fabric that repelled the very idea of grime. He stepped out of a black town car, his gaze sweeping over the town green with a look of profound, clinical distaste. "Quaint," he said, the word dripping with a condescension that made Helen's teeth ache. He looked at her, his eyes lingering on her grease-stained overalls and the red, blistered skin of her forearms. "And I suppose this is the local color. Ms. McCarthy, I presume? I've heard quite a bit about your tenacity." Helen didn't answer. She stood near the edge of the stage, the scorched ledger still clutched in her hand. She felt small in the face of his polished arrogance, a relic of a dying world being mocked by the man who was killing it. "Don't look so grim," Vane said, flashing a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "You're getting a very fair price for a pile of rotting wood and rusted iron. In a year, this harbor will be something people actually want to visit. You should be thanking us for cleaning up the mess." He turned away, dismissing her entirely, and began talking to the notary. Helen felt a familiar heat rising in her chest, but it wasn't the blind rage of the night before. It was something colder, sharper. She turned and walked back toward the shop. She needed to pack. She needed to get her tools, the only things she actually owned, before the locks were changed for good. The shop was silent, the air heavy with the scent of old grease and the ghost of her father's pipe tobacco. Helen moved through the space like a stranger, tossing her wrenches and sockets into her heavy steel toolbox. Each clink of metal against metal felt like a nail in a coffin. She sat at her father's old desk, the one with the scarred wood and the drawer she'd pried open. She looked at the blueprints again, the Oakhaven North Star Resort. She looked at the topography maps, the ones Diane had signed off on. Wait. Helen leaned in, her eyes narrowing. She spent her life reading blueprints for engines, for hulls, for the complex geometry of things that had to survive the ocean. She knew the Oakhaven coastline better than anyone. She'd spent 40 years diving in these waters, repairing the pilings, clearing the intake valves. The blueprints showed the main foundation of the resort sitting on a section of the harbor floor that was marked as stable silt. But Helen knew that wasn't silt. She grabbed her old depth-sounding logs, the handwritten ones her father had kept since the 50s. She cross-referenced the coordinates. A slow, grim smile spread across her face. She didn't pack the rest of her tools. Instead, she grabbed her specialized sonar kit and a pair of heavy-duty waders. She walked out to the end of the pier, ignoring the no trespassing signs that had already been posted. She spent an hour on the water, her small skiff bobbing in the gray swells. She dropped the sensors, watched the digital readout on the screen. The data didn't lie. Beneath the 3 feet of silt was a layer of reinforced concrete, a containment cap. She knew exactly what was under that cap. In the 1950s, the old cannery had been a chemical processing plant for a brief, disastrous stint. When they shut down, they didn't clean up. They just dumped the toxic runoff into a deep trench and capped it with concrete and a don't ask, don't tell policy. The North Star blueprints called for driving heavy steel pilings directly through that trench. If they hit that cap, the runoff, decades of concentrated arsenic and mercury, would puncture like an abscess. It wouldn't just ruin the harbor, it would kill the entire coastline for a generation. The lobster beds, the fishing grounds, everything Oakhaven relied on would be poisoned in a matter of days. And North Star's surveyors had missed it, or more likely, they'd been told not to look too closely. Helen rowed back to shore, her heart hammering with a new kind of purpose. She didn't have money. She didn't have the law, but she had the truth. And in a town like Oakhaven, the truth was the only thing that could sink a ship like North Star. She walked back to the festival grounds, the crowd even denser now as the closing ceremony began. Richard Vane was on the stage, the notary standing beside him. The deed spread out on the podium like a sacrificial lamb. And now, Vane said into the microphone, his voice booming over the speakers, we finalize the future of Oakhaven. Miss Foster, if you would? Diane stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the pen. Stop. Helen's voice wasn't loud, but it had a frequency that cut through the noise of the festival. She marched up the steps of the stage, her boots thudding on the wood. The crowd went silent. Vane's smile faltered, replaced by a look of genuine annoyance. Ms. McCarthy, you're becoming a nuisance, Vane said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. The deal is closed. Step down. The deal isn't closed until the deed is recorded, Helen said, stepping up to the podium. She laid her depth-sounding logs and the old topographical maps on top of the contract. And you're not recording anything today, Richard. What is this? Vane sneered, glancing at the papers. More local folklore? It's an environmental death warrant, Helen said, her voice steady and clear. Your foundation plan sits directly on top of the 1954 toxic containment trench. You drive your pilings there, you puncture the cap, you poison the harbor, you kill the lobsters, the fish, and the town. And you did it knowingly, didn't you? You falsified the survey data to avoid the cost of a proper cleanup. The crowd began to murmur, the word poison rippling through the audience like a shockwave. Vane's face went from annoyed to a sickly, pale gray. That's absurd, Vane stammered, his polished veneer finally cracking. Our surveyors are top tier. This is just the desperate ramblings of a... I've already sent the coordinates to the EPA and the State Environmental Board, Helen lied. She hadn't yet, but she would the second she got to a phone. And I'm filing for a whistleblower injunction. You know what that means, Richard. It means this land gets tied up in federal court for the next 30 years. It means your investors pull out by Tuesday. It means North Star is dead in the water. Vane looked at the papers, then at the crowd, then back at Helen. He saw the cold, unwavering light in her stormy gray eyes, and realized he was looking at his own ruin. He didn't argue. He didn't try to charm his way out. He was a shark, and he knew when the water was full of blood. He stepped back from the podium, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. This is an oversight, he muttered, signaling to his security detail. We will conduct our own investigation. The closing is suspended. He practically ran from the stage, his town car tires screeching as he fled the festival grounds. The crowd erupted into a roar, half cheer, half angry shout, as the realization of what had almost happened set in. Helen stood at the podium, her hands gripping the wood so hard her knuckles turned white. She had won. The resort was dead. The harbor was safe. But as the noise of the crowd faded, she looked at Diane. The shop was still broke. The debts were still real. The victory was a hollow one for the business that bore their names. We still have to sell, don't we? Diane asked, her voice quiet in the sudden stillness of the stage. Yeah, Helen said, her voice heavy with the weight of the truth. We still have to sell. They sat in the empty workshop one last time, the afternoon sun casting long, golden bars across the concrete floor. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaos of the festival. They had reached an agreement. They would sell the property to the local fishing co-op for a fraction of the North Star price. Just enough to clear the debts and get Diane's mother the care she needed. The harbor would stay in the hands of the people who worked it. The McCarthy and Foster sign would come down, replaced by something new, something communal. I'm sorry, Helen, Diane said, her voice small in the vastness of the shop. For the lies, for the investigator, I didn't know what else to do. I know, Helen said. And she did. She saw the lines of exhaustion on Diane's face, the years of carrying a burden that Helen had been too proud to share. I'm sorry, too, for being so damn stubborn, for not seeing you. They sat there for a long time, not speaking, just listening to the distant lap of the water against the docks. The bond between them, once as strong as a steel cable, was frayed. The strands snapped by months of betrayal and resentment. They were no longer partners. They were barely friends. They were just two women who had survived a storm and found themselves on different shores. Helen stood up and walked to the workbench. She picked up her heavy pipe wrench, the one she'd used to defend the shop, the one that had been in her hand for 25 years. She tucked it into her toolbox and buckled the straps. She walked to the door, her boots echoing on the concrete. She didn't look back. She knew every inch of this place by heart. She didn't need a final glance to remember it. She left the keys on the workbench, right next to a pile of old invoices and a single faded photograph of her father. She walked out onto the pier, the evening air cool and smelling of salt. Diane was standing by her car, her bags already packed. They looked at each other, a long, silent moment that held 40 years of history, of shared dreams and bitter failures. Helen didn't say goodbye. There were no words left that wouldn't feel like a lie. She got into her truck and started the engine. The old motor roared to life, a rough, grinding sound that was the only music she ever really loved. As she drove away from the docks, she saw Diane in the rearview mirror, a small, lonely figure standing on the edge of the water. The town was saved. The harbor was safe. But as Helen McCarthy drove into the gathering dark, she knew that some things, once broken, could never be fixed, no matter how hard you turned the wrench.